oh, there is Benny. I hope he doesn't want to sell this car in Europe, because then he needs for Ireland and the UK the steering wheel on the other side, which adds another 50, 60 million to it. Then he will come with Euro NCAP 5-star. Then he will come with the wipers have to wipe at 200 kilometers per hour, which we don't give a flip about here, but it's very important. And then he will come with fuel consumption and things like that. So it was a little bit like that.
Hello and welcome to the Auto Ethnographer. I'm John Stech, your host on this journey. We travel the globe to bring you stories about culture and the global automotive industry. Fasten your seatbelt and let's get started. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Auto Ethnographer. We have a fantastic guest on today, somebody who can tell us a lot of stories about a lot of places across the planet in the automotive industry. His name is Benny Oeyen, and he is an absolute professional in the area of product planning and product strategy. From being the first non-Japanese in Mazda Motors Europe to joining Chrysler in Europe and later moving to the United States for the company, to moving back to Europe with Kia Motors Europe, and finally landing in Shanghai with General Motors, he has truly covered the globe. Today, he's going to share some of his experiences and observations with the brands from 3 different Asian countries, from Japan, Korea, and China, as well as talking a little bit about the American brands of Chrysler, Jeep, and Dodge and his experiences as a Belgian in the United States. So settle in, get comfortable, because this is going to be an interesting and probably even humorous journey. Benny, welcome to the Auto Ethnographer.
Thank you very much, John, and very glad to be here. You put a lot of pressure on me, very humorous, so I have to start with a joke, right? But I won't. I won't start with a joke because now the bar is very high. But Benny Oeyen, I'm a Belgian, which is already a complicated cultural experiment as a country, right, with 3 languages, Dutch, French, and German. Let's not forget that. But I was born and grew up in Germany, to make it even more complicated, because my father was stationed with NATO in Germany at the time of the Cold War, and there was still a West and East Germany, and there were a lot of British troops and Dutch troops and Belgian troops and American troops, and basically they were trying to prevent Russia from doing what they're doing right now, right? So this was this was my whole life. Basically, we were 130 kilometers, 90 miles from the Iron Curtain. There we could see the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet-style watchtower. So it made a big impression on me as a child. But we're not here to talk about that. We're here to talk about my experience in the car business and in the multicultural environment. So let me start off. So after I studied at the university and did my military service, which then was also, for the reasons I just mentioned, still compulsory. We had conscription in every West European country except the United Kingdom. So I had to go for 1 year to the army, basic training. I became a 4x4 off-road instructor, which was really, really cool, I have to say. I learned a lot about differentials and stuff like that. And I've always been a car guy. And like it was at these times. So for the younger generation who might be listening to this, this is very strange for you what I'm going to say now, but there was no internet. And a job ad, it was in the Saturday section of the newspaper. And I know it's when I tell my children, they think like I was born in the Holy Roman Empire or something like that. That's how old it sounds. But and there was this ad: leading Asian car manufacturer is looking for the European headquarters for a junior or starting product manager. And I go for that. And I got it. And it was the European headquarters for Mazda, based in Brussels, called Mazda Europe. And I went in there in 1990, and that was quite an interesting experience. But I'll come to that afterwards. But indeed, as you said, I was the first non-Japanese, non-admin or non-secretary walking in there, so it was quite interesting. Afterwards, I went to Chrysler Europe, also based in Brussels, in 1996. I can talk about that a little bit because it combined my love for cars with my love for America, which I always had. I always thought the US is such a cool country. I listened to American music. I read about the US. It was always kind of my dream country, my absolute example in the world, and I really have an emotional connection to the US. So to me, that the American brands, one of the big three, set up shop in Brussels, where I was working already, was a great opportunity. So I did that. So I can talk about that a little bit with them. So I worked in Brussels, in Auburn Hills, in Zurich, Switzerland, and back in Auburn Hills. Then I was basically headhunted away and went to Kia. Very interesting experience, also from a cultural point of view, to a Hyundai Kia, very Korean company. Went to Frankfurt, Germany, work in the European operations. And then finally, after 6 years there, I went to China with General Motors. So quite something. Worked in 6, 7 countries. So now I'm in London, based in London. I changed the sector 6, 7 years ago, and I work for a mining company where we sell a lot to automotive, for the precious metals, for the catalytic converters, etc. But I'm also in the corporate venture capital world, where I do startup companies all over the world with technology that uses our metals. And now lately, I'm also helping. I'm back in automotive a little bit. I'm a partner in a company that is a consulting company for everything China auto, and we are connecting European distributors or wholesalers who are looking at this plethora of Chinese brands and figuring out which brand we want to be part of that, because China is hot right now when it comes to cars. They're very advanced. And which one should we import here? Because there's so many and we don't know anything. That's what I do now. So I'm a partner there with the owner of the company, gentleman called Bruce. So that's a little bit my journey here. So 3 continents, 7 countries. Yeah, and as you said, probably a lot of stories to tell.
No, it's a fantastic story already. It's so difficult to even choose where to begin. So I think let's just make an obvious choice and start at the beginning. And you told me you were the first non-Japanese at Mazda Motors Europe. I mean, how was that? That must have been interesting because the company was brand new in Europe. Yes, they must have just arrived, or they've been there and they worked primarily with a Japanese workforce for a long period of time.
Yeah, they didn't really have a strong European presence. Then they worked with wholesalers, with private companies who wholesale and then do a distribution network in almost all the countries, except in the largest car market, which is Germany. So MMD, or Mazda Motors Deutschland, that was a wholly owned subsidiary, but all the rest was with private distributors, and they had like a small coordination office, and then also a design and R&D office in Frankfurt that they had as well. But like for the whole marketing side, sales side, product planning, etc., I was the first one. That was based in Brussels. It was split at that time, and yeah, so it was quite something because first of all, I mean, in 1990, Japan was probably a bit like China now, kind of an exotic country that everybody was a bit afraid of, that they were taking over the world. Huh? You remember these days, then wasn't it that time when they also bought Hollywood and the Empire State Building and things like that? It was like Japan Inc. And so that was one thing. So the culture and the way of doing business with Japanese was still very foreign, not known to many Westerners. That's one. But then secondly, I also have to say Mazda was very, very different to the big boys. The big boys are Toyota, and Nissan and Honda. Toyota, Nissan and Honda are much larger than Mazda, and they're from the major global cities. They're from the Tokyo, Yokohama area, right? Where people don't, even in 1990, people don't giggle as a white Westerner if you walk the streets. In Hiroshima, the people watched and the schoolgirls giggled because they saw somebody like me. So it was still quite different. So Mazda much smaller, and they're from Hiroshima, which is the countryside, right? It's like I don't know, Honda, Toyota, Nissan were from New York, Chicago, LA, and I don't know. Mazda was from I don't know, somewhere in South Carolina or something like that. You know what I mean? Very more countryside. They called them the older Japanese called the people from there Onobori-san. It means like a bit redneck or countryside, I should say. So it was very, very, very Japanese. So I remember walking in there, and the staff, when they were doing office work, took off their shoes and they were wearing slippers and shuffling around on the carpet and things I'd never seen, and taking the naps at lunch on their desk like this. So all the cliches, and doing the exercises in the morning on a tape. I saw that in Hiroshima. They also replicated that in Brussels. And this very, very Japanese stuff, which I thought was really cool and interesting. And that was just great for me. Mazda was actually on a roll. In Germany, which was and still is in Europe the toughest market to compete, because it's the lion's den. You're up against all German OEMs to come there as an importer. They had the number one non-German car for a long time, which was at that time called the Mazda 626. It's their D-segment sedan, and it was very good value for money. Very good in the reliability, so kind of JD Power statistics and things like that. So it had a following, but it was still quite small. But I wanted to expand. I wanted to professionalize it, and yeah, it was really a lot of fun for me. And they saw me a little bit as this bridge between the Japanese stuff and then all these different countries where they had private importers, because then you have to deal with their management. It's very different than Mazda Germany was wholly owned by Mazda. And at the end of the day, they had to do what Hiroshima/Brussels said, but the others not. You had to negotiate with them. There were a big importer in France, and there was a big importer in Spain, and there was one in Italy, and there was one in Belgium, and there was one in Holland, and there was one in all the Scandinavian countries, etc. And sometimes the language and the cultural bridge was very difficult, and I felt like a fish in the water there, because I'm this multicultural mutt. If you put in United Nations Google search images, maybe my picture pops up or something like that. Sometimes that's what my friend said. But and then very quickly I established my network, and they liked to have me in the meetings because I could see both sides and things like that. But yeah, it was very interesting to get to know them. Also their way of working. In 1990, then I went to Hiroshima. It was the first time in my life. I was in my late 20s and I set foot in Japan. It was quite amazing how they work. Hardworking and very precise, very disciplined, super on the execution. I remember visiting car plants in Europe before. I mean, it was like the old industrial affair, right? A bit dirty and a bit dusty, and people kind of in a bad mood, like putting cars together, kind of a rough environment. I think especially if we have people listening from the Detroit area or from the Big Three, they know what I'm talking about also in the American car industry. And then I went to there, and you saw the pride that these people have. Even the lowest guy, a simple job on the assembly line, putting the oil filter in, had his little gloves and the Mazda hat and his name and the Mazda logo, and they were like proud to put the oil filter in. Where if you go to a European factory, they were like, God damn it, I have to put 500 more in, and then my shift is gone, and then I can go drinking with my buddies. Right? That was written all over their face, but in Malta it was very different. And I think that also, it's a small detail what I talk to you about now, but that resulted in really good quality. So yeah, that's their very big advantage. What I also saw is like everything in life, yin and yang, right? Where there's light, there's shadows. Where there's roses, there's thorns. You also have, everything has an advantage, has a disadvantage. The disadvantage sometimes was a bit, the Japanese culture is quite conservative. They're not risk takers. They're not go-getters. They're not jumpers and do it, a bit like the Americans are, that the Japanese are not at all. And because of that, because there's a risk avoidance, which is sometimes good because you don't do crazy things and it's very predictable, but you sometimes miss opportunities, right? Because you become a bit slow and inert. And so very interesting. But this was a great time. I learned a lot. They had some great products in the D segment, as I said, the Mazda 626 it was called, in the C segment the 323. They had the poor man's Porsche. I remember that it was called the 323F because it had the pop-up headlamps like Porsche had at the time, but for a quarter of the price, that kind of stuff. And then they had the very famous MX-5, which is called the Miata in the US, and it was in Europe was the MX-5, and it was the reinvention of the classic British roadster, but then without the parts falling off of the car and the quality issues that the British car industry faced at the end of the day. So it was Japanese precision mechanics with the concept, the fantastic concept of a roadster, and that was fantastic. So great success with that. Also some failures. Huh? So of course, they looked at what the others are doing in the luxury segment, in the premium segment. You can cash in much more premium than in the volume segment, especially if you have the parts bin of the volume segment, right? That's what Audi does with Volkswagen, right? That's what Lexus very successfully does with Toyota. And Nissan, and Acura for Honda, and etc. So Infiniti with Nissan. So Mazda said we need to do this too. So they launched a premium brand called Xedos, Xedos. So I was there right from the beginning, looking for the name and the agencies with the name, and you can imagine the whole thing. But at the end, it really didn't work. I mean, even Lexus was struggling a lot. They only recently, very recently, now 30 years later, get a bit of traction because hybrids and stuff like that, where they have advantage, is getting into vogue. But then even Lexus was an absolute niche player compared to Toyota. So Xedos went absolutely nowhere. And they also had these big plans with Mazda, with the 6-cylinder and even a 12-cylinder cars and 8 cylinders and things like that. So that didn't really work. But interesting company, always interesting also on the powertrain side. For example, they had a rotary engine. You probably remember that, the RX-7. And with the RX-7, during my time at Mazda Europe, they also won the Le Mans 24 hours with a rotary engine. I think it was 93 or 94, something like that. Must have been like that. And it was quite amazing. So very special company, niche, quite profitable at the time, but at the mercy of the exchange rates, because everything was made in Japan. And the yen exchange rate versus, there was no euro back then, but there was the European exchange rate mechanism, which is kind of the same as euro. When the Japanese yen just took off and increased, then your profit was wiped out. In a B segment car like the Mazda 121 or something like that, you have such thin margins. A little exchange rate fluctuation in a month can make you from a profitable car into a negative car. So these kind of things were really complicated. They then became went to very difficult financial situation because they were a big exporter. They were small, very small in Japan itself, but relatively to their size in Japan, they were a big exporter. And then with the exchange rate of the yen, Mazda really got into trouble, and Ford took a majority stake, and then Ford started how can I say having more management influence, etc. But that was also around the time when I left to Chrysler then. But yeah, interesting experience for me to see that.
It really sounds that way. So tell me, how did a 20-something-year-old Benny Oeyen, who is really at the beginning of his career, figure out how to navigate with the Japanese culture in the office? You know, you're Belgian, you grew up in Germany. Those two cultures are pretty direct. You know, they tell you the truth just like that. And the Japanese are a little bit different. It's more indirect and much more nuanced. How did you figure that out? Did you have any major, let's say, bloopers during the beginning of your career?
Yeah, I probably had a couple of bloopers, but it's you kind of learn along. There was no things like cultural training or something like that. Cultural training was you just start You do it, and that was it. And you kind of figure it out, but it's true. So, but after some time, the indirectness is amazing. You learn how to translate the language, the indirect language choice, like even body language. A typical Japanese body language is for a Japanese manager. If something is difficult and he's not sure, or basically doesn't want to do it, or is not agreeing with you, is you put your teeth together and you suck in air. Ano ne, difficult. Nah, Benny-san. If you hear that, then you know, like, no, this is no good. I'll have to rework the paper. So you kind of get the gist of it after some time. And I thought it was really funny. Usually, oh, by the time this will also shock the millennials. This sucking in air was usually cigarette air, cigarette smoke then, because at that time it was still very normal to smoke in the offices, especially of Japanese companies. So quite amazing. Yeah, you just figure it out, and that's why I think I very quickly established myself as a name, because I was there for product and making sure that the product is that comes from Japan is in the frame of the possible. Is adapted to the European markets. For example, at that time, I still remember in Germany, that's all gone now, but you had these insurance classifications with horsepower and you couldn't go over there. So every time you went over that level, your insurance premium went up. And it was, I think it was 75 horsepower, 90, 115, and 150. I still have them in my head. So the stupidest thing you can do is, for example, bring something with 151 horsepower, because you don't go any faster and you pay the higher premium. Things like that, right? So we helped them with that. And at that time, the EU market was not very integrated yet. You still had homologation requirements separate for every country. Just imagine that you have to do 27 different homologation things. Now you do one. And it's for the whole European market, which is 14 million, 15 million cars or something per year. So thank God for all that, but then it was still much more complicated. But what I wanted to say is I was like seen as this. I think it's also sometimes it's something you have. I was just born with that. I have antennas. I naturally adapt to the situation, and I know how to deal with different cultures and not offend them. Maybe that's my Belgian DNA, because in Belgium it's very complicated, and whether you're on the Flemish side or on the French-speaking side, you always offend the other because they think differently. They have different opinions, different cultures, the Latin culture versus the Germanic culture, etc. So we're naturally born compromise seekers, I should say. And so maybe I had that a little bit in me, because it was not only between the Japanese and the and the Europeans, because the Europeans didn't exist. Sometimes it was make Europe speak with one voice, because Japan wants to know, okay, what does Europe want? And then, well, the French want this, the Germans want that, the English, by definition, always want something else, and then the Spanish don't know yet, but they'll probably do something else. So things like that, right? So, and just to make that, and then the Germans against the French in a meeting publicly disagreeing, and then the Japanese want, well, we won't listen then, we'll listen to the Americans and we'll do that, and Europe just. So I try to avoid that and find this compromise. So yeah, you kind of learn that and get along with it. But yeah, you have to learn it. But what helped me is I did a lot of trips to Japan. Sometimes I was stationed there for 3 weeks or 4 weeks to work on the product introduction. And you became, well, listen, I was in my late 20s. You become buddies with the others of my age, who I still have contact with. I visited them a couple of years ago in Hiroshima and things, and it was really a lot of fun. And of course, we went out together, went eating and clubbing and karaoke singing and all the fun stuff that you can do. And you become kind of part of them. I have to say they're very welcoming if you're part of because Japan at first might seem a bit, oh, it's like a foreign planet, and I'm not sure. But if you're with the same company, they have this very strong company equals family feeling. And when you're part of the proud Mazda family in Hiroshima, you're part of them, and you're basically a good guy. And I got to, yeah, and after some time you establish a network and you get things done. You get things done for the European distributors. They appreciate that. So it's this virtuous circle that gets set into motion. So that's a little bit how it went.
Yeah, as the company grew, obviously it gained success. Some of those products are fantastic. They're pretty iconic, like the MX-5 or Miata, as it's known in the US. Um, as it gained success, you also grew. Were you, as the first non-Japanese, were you seen as somewhat of a mentor for some of the people that came in later, or they also just kind of stumbled and fumbled along by themselves?
No, no, I was seen a bit as a mentor. Afterwards, we hired one or two people. Then we merged the organization with the German organization because I said Germany, they had to save money as well. The German organization, so it moved from Brussels to Leverkusen, which is near Cologne. And then Mazda in one building was then Mazda Deutschland, Mazda Germany, and Mazda Europe. And then because of the location there was more change. People went from the German organization to the European organization for first back and forth. And then, as I said, because of the financial trouble Mazda was in, Ford took a big stake, controlling stake. And if I remember, at the end of my tenure, it was a certain Mr. Wallace. I think he was a Scotsman from Ford, and he became the first CEO of Mazda. So a gaijin, gaijin means like non-Japanese people in Japanese language, became the CEO of a major blue chip Japanese powerhouse. And there, I remember then walking in there were TV crews outside, etc., because it was big breaking news in Japan. So it was a bit Carlos Ghosn of Nissan. 1.0, right? Goal was 2.0 was the second time, but it was a much bigger one. But it already happened before. That was a big time. And then more, how can I say, Western people started pouring in. But as I said, in 1996, I left. I was through connections, headhunted away, kind of to connections to Chrysler Europe, who was setting up shop in Brussels, right, where I was working.
Coming back for 1 second to the Mazda experience, when Ford did that, I guess I don't want to call it a takeover, but the majority stake and installed in CEO, that story was quite similarly felt at Volvo, and Volvo had quite an influence from Ford. Was that similar at Mazda, that you had a Ford influence that kind of pushed its way through the company and through the layers?
It was, but I was at the tail end of my time at Mazda, and at the very beginning. So I have it more from hearsay, but of course they did. They combined a lot. Actually, I was already a little bit before Ford took the majority. When the trouble started, we had a B segment car. B segment car was the Mazda 121. A very cute little car, funny car. It was like right out of a cartoon, because normally B segment cars were 3-door and 5-door hatches, right? So 2-box cars. And they made a 3-box car. So with a little boot around, it looked like a little baby. It was amazing. And it was a runaway success. And we couldn't get enough of it. I remember sales meetings with the European countries, and they were discussing, and the fight and the tension was about who would get more. France, it's not fair, the Germans get too money, and don't you know, and we want 5,000 more, and blah, blah, blah. So there was this. And then the yen started appreciating. And this was a B segment car, and they were all made in Hiroshima. And yeah, you can't. It's a very price sensitive segment with high price elasticity from the consumer side. You can't just slap a 15% higher price on a B segment car. You're dead in the water. And then it went underwater. Then it became like, how many cars can we afford to sell of this runaway success? And we decided, well, the ideal CFO, of course, will say, yeah, just stop selling. You know how CFOs are. They look at their Excel sheet, they go, it's negative, stop. And then in 3 years, we come back. It doesn't work like that. If you vacate a segment, you're forgotten in that segment. So we wanted to keep a foot in it, but we couldn't afford it anymore. So we went to Ford, who at that time had like, I believe, 20% or something like that share already in Mazda, but they were not active. Then later they increased it. And we looked at their B segment car, which was called the Ford Fiesta, very famous. And so what we did is like a very cheap, and I got put in charge of that with almost no money and very little time. And so it was called the BE91M. So B for B segment, E for Europe, 91 was the code of the car, and M was the Mazda version. It was just a little cladding and wheel caps on the outside and on the inside, but we quickly needed to do this, and I was put in charge of that. So to me, that was also very interesting, because then suddenly I had meetings with these typical British engineers and product planners from Dunton, which is the technical center in the UK, and there were giants at the time in Europe, talking to little Mazda, and then try to arrange that with the engineers in Hiroshima and the design center in Frankfurt. That was quite interesting. But yeah, we did it. Launched in, I still remember, at the Brussels Motor Show in January 1996. The target was 25,000 a year, and we hit it. We did it, and it's not a car that I'm proud of from a pure car perspective, but because it's like minimum cosmetic changes. But it saved the B segment for Mazda, which then later became the Mazda 2 and things like that when things got better. That's what I did. So I was already a bit Ford cooperation avant la lettre.
But that's a great example, because it shows that, when there is a need, then also the Japanese culture can move very quickly and be very adapting.
That went very quickly then. Yeah. No. So please don't get me wrong. They're not always this slow look, but in general, their attitude is not risk takers, go getters. They analyze and very detailed, and it has to be precise. Analog with Germany, actually, a little bit sometimes. I think the German culture is also very precise, very engineering driven, analyze everything. Where Americans are that, but at a certain point, Americans just say, like, now it's enough. Let's go.
Well,
yeah,
as you said, let's go. So let's go actually to your next step in your career path, which is jumping fully on board with an American company. At that point in time, it was Chrysler Corp, located, of course, up in Detroit / Auburn Hills, Michigan. And you said you were starting or helping them to really set up the office in Brussels and get them going in Europe. I'd love to learn a little bit more about what was happening then, and what kind of a role did you play, and what was your interaction with the Americans? You said you already liked the music and the movies and the culture. How was that? Was that like a fish going into water?
Oh, very much. I was the happiest fish, and the water was great. It was American water, and I loved it. So yeah, it was really like that. They already had a small European kind of rep office in Frankfurt, but then they said, we're going to make it really a big operation, and seriously, we wanted to seriously grow. Then they relocated to Brussels, and yeah, so the operation became much bigger, and that's where I came on board. I was in product management, and well, I of course, everybody says what they did is the core, but it is the core. At the end, you sell product, and if the product isn't fit for the market that you sell in, you will fail, and all the rest doesn't matter anymore. So, and I was there, and I was trying to do what Mr. Trump wants now the Europeans to do, is to buy more American cars, right? And it's not so easy, right? It's not just, hey, just buy some, and the Europeans did not buy American cars because of some tariffs or some hanky-panky stuff. They didn't buy them because in masses, because they were not appropriate for their needs. So it's very, very simple. You have to make sure these needs are translated into engineering actions, which then are translated into product, which then is translated into more sales. That's how it works, right? And when I went there, so I was responsible for the whole Chrysler lineup, and together with my colleagues. So we worked with the engineers back in Auburn Hills and say, listen, this is what we need. This is the engines we need. We made business cases and things like that for certain cars and variants. But they were quite successful at the time, because the US had cars that the Europeans didn't have yet, and it had a niche appeal factor in Europe. And I'll give you two examples. Back then in 96, the minivan, there was nothing except the Chrysler Voyager. Like, that's how we sold it. We always sold it with one brand, was Chrysler. And then you had the Renault Espace. That was it. The Germans were asleep. The Italians were asleep. There was absolutely nothing. The Swedish were doing their square Volvos and Saabs, and that was it. And there was nothing. And the Japanese at that time, they started a bit. Toyota with the Previa, maybe you remember that, but very, very little. Mazda tried with the MPV. But that was cool, right? It was the original minivan. Another thing was SUVs. Europeans didn't have SUVs. There were no SUVs, but there was the Cherokee and the Grand Cherokee. That was very cool. And then to link the SUV capabilities, off-road capabilities with luxury, there was only Jeep that did it, and then very niche and super expensive Range Rover, right? They put leather trims and wood and all that fine British interior stuff into the Range Rover, and Grand Cherokee did the same in Europe, and that was very very appealing. Right, the problem was, of course, that they had huge engines that were drinking petrol as drunken sailors. In the US, this didn't matter because at that time it was like 140 or 180 a gallon, where in Europe it was already 6 or 7 a gallon. Because of taxation in Europe, there's very high taxation on petrol because all the Europeans want free college and free healthcare, and that's part of where the money comes from. Right? So it's for free, doesn't exist. Somebody always pays. And so we had to have diesels in there. So there was an adoption already with a diesel engine for the Grand Cherokee. It was, I hate to say it was a terrible diesel engine. It was from Venti Motori, an Italian one, 3.1, I think 5-cylinder. It made a tractor kind of noise, so it was not very good. And then later, we can come to that a little bit with the merger. Then we got really the fine Mercedes diesels in there, and that was excellent. But yeah, so it was kind of cool. So they had the Voyager, the Cherokee, and the Grand Cherokee, so SUVs. And then later the PT Cruiser, which was the ultimate Americana retro thing for Europe. I mean, it was exotic for Americans, the PT Cruiser, because I remember them selling over sticker price when it was launched. So in Europe, it was even more exotic, and that was a runaway success, and we did very, very well. So yeah, so it was really interesting. I loved working with the Americans. Americans are very easy to work with. Basically, they just take you at face value. They don't care where you're from. When you perform, it's great. It's lose its first name basis, right? Immediately. I mean, I was like a relatively junior product manager, and when Bob Lutz came, I was like, "Hi, Mr. Lutz. Hey, call me Bob," you know. So it immediately puts you at ease. There is something about the American culture that's very working culture. It's very very cool and very inclusive in that sense, and I loved it. I thrived there. Also, many things in life depend on your immediate boss. I had a fantastic guy who hired me. His name was Steve Bartoli. He retired now, but God bless him. One of the best guys I ever worked for. We had a great team, a lot of fun. And yeah, we were actually quite successful. Of course, also typical American is you set incredible goals, which then don't materialize sometimes, right? So very optimistic, and yeah, we're going to take over the world immediately, and that of course didn't happen. But still, it was a quite a nice and interesting period to try to work with the very American. Because as I worked for Mazda, which was probably of all the Japanese, the most Japanese, because they were not from Yokohama and not so international, etc. From the big three, Chrysler was the most American because it was purely American. Because in GM and Ford, yeah, they are doing business in Europe and all over the globe since 100 years, and they have execs who lived here and there, etc. I mean, in Chrysler, people were still like, "Oh my God, Europe, can you drink the water there? And you have electricity?" Almost. I make it a little bit a joke, but it was almost like, "Oh my God, what? You're going to go outside of Michigan? Wow!" So it was very American. I think Chrysler at the time sold 2.4 million cars or something like that, of which 2.3 million were in the US and Canada. So it was a purely American company. And I liked that a lot. I thought it was awesome, to use a very American word.
I used to joke around in Michigan that international trade meant to drive across the Ohio border to buy beer.
Yeah, it's true. They were very much like that. The culture was very much like that, but in a good way, not in a bad way. They were not
Right.
bad or mean or like, "Oh no, everything has to be like we do it." They were very respectful in listening to it, and they knew it, and they wanted to learn and do better because they want their company to thrive, obviously, which we try to help for. It was pretty cool, actually.
When you started, was the Eurostar manufacturing facility in Graz, Austria, already operational, or was that something
Yes.
that came along after
No,
you
it was
started?
it was already there. It was already there. It made, if I remember well, it made Foragers and Grand Cherokees. Yeah,
Correct, correct. I
it was
actually worked on
already
the
there.
supplier side, and
Yes.
my company was actually supplying instrument panels into Eurostar at the time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was already there. So it's not that they didn't look at it at all, but still, I mean, my group in Chrysler was called International, right? They were called it International. Everything that's, and yeah. So I had to establish links with the platform teams. They were called. You had the small car platform team and the large car platform team and the Jeep. They were still located in Plymouth Road, I think it was called. There. Their facility there, and you have to establish relationships with them. And every time when International came around the corner, and I understand that the engineers kind of rolled their eyes because it meant a lot of requests and no volume. Right, and a big headache for them. Right, oh, there is Benny. I hope he doesn't want to sell this car in Europe, because then he needs for Ireland and the UK the steering wheel on the other side, which adds another 50, 60 million to it. Then he will come with Euro NCAP 5-star. Then he will come with the wipers have to wipe at 200 kilometers per hour, which we don't give a flip about here, but it's very important. And then he will come with fuel consumption and things like that. So it was a little bit like that. But on the other hand, you also, at a certain moment, I was like this guy, then there first in Brussels, and then we can talk about that in Auburn Hills. That was after the merger. You establish personal relationships also a little bit, and it's your personal credibility that gets a lot done, right? That's something I learned. But we can talk about that later. But then when I was there, so I started in October '96, and only not even 2 years later, was it May or June '98?
Yes.
You said in one of your podcasts you were driving home and you couldn't believe it. I still remember where I was. We were introducing the 300M, the Chrysler 300M, talking about the niche car in Europe. And we had a select group of European journalists, and we were in Atlanta, Georgia. And there was the US lounge, and we piggybacked on that with our journalists. And we were driving around, and there was like a big rumor at the time that Chrysler was going to buy Honda. That was a big rumor. And Chrysler was going to buy or go together with BMW, because Bob Lutz has met the Quant lady in Frankfurt who owns. In fact, there was all these rumors. And then I remember us standing, and the head of marketing and PR, and he was a top PR guy also, and he passed away. He was the boss of my boss, Tom Kowaleski. He was standing, he was saying, something's up, because he was on the phone. My colleagues tell me that the whole executive floor is empty and all the corporate jets have left the airport. So something's up. And then we're like, and we were all speculating, BMW, Honda, maybe Nissan, what is it going to be? Not once. There were all these journalists, all these Chrysler guys. Nobody knew about it. And not a single time. I think all the OEMs came up except one, which is Mercedes. I don't think anybody ever said, I think it's going to be Mercedes. And then it came like, what? So I remember. And then suddenly the next day, that was late in the afternoon. And the next morning, we were going to have a product briefing on the 300M and the specs and the wheelbase and the track and the acceleration and the cowl forward design. And nobody cared anymore. It was all about the Daimler Chrysler merger. So it was, there was this moment, one of these moments in time where I remember where I was. And then, so I became like a quite interesting guy, right? Because I was not really an American. I'm not an American, but I knew a lot, and I was kind of get the Americana swag kind of over me. I could get along with them. They noticed that, the German management. But I was also not the German, so not the Stuttgart in breed that they were sending over like that. But I could speak German. I speak German like a German, although it's not my language, my mother tongue, because I was born and grew up there. So they thought this is an interesting guy. And then a gentleman who I met there, Thomas Hausch, came along. He was a Mercedes manager, put in charge of the whole international. He said, "Yeah, you're the guy. Do you want to come over to Auburn Hills?" So I packed up my family with two little kids, 4 and 2, and moved from Belgium to Auburn Hills in 2001. And a big adventure started in the wonderful tech center in Auburn Hills along I-75. I had, yeah, so I would say Chrysler Europe, and then my time in Auburn Hills was fantastic. Probably one of the best times in my life. Was fantastic. Professional times in my life, I should say. It's really great.
No, I think what's interesting at that point in time, which I covered a little bit in my podcast before when I gave a little bit of a monologue about it, Chrysler International was barely 10% of the sales volumes around the planet. And here we were going into this product offensive with, what was it, a dozen, 15 different models that were rolling out over just a few years, in the early 2000s. And you already described a couple of different examples where you had to ask for right-hand drive with I don't know, a right-hand drive ashtray and all these special things that had to be delivered for Europe. This must have been a huge challenge when you were actually sitting in Auburn Hills, having to discuss and
Yeah,
negotiate, 15 different models with the engineers and trying to get all the European and
yeah.
international, beyond Europe, requirements into them.
Sometimes purely on a pure business case point of view, it didn't make sense. Sometimes it did, but sometimes it didn't. Or it was very adventurous financial accounting, let's put it like that. And you smell that right after some time, you know how that works. Then the volumes seem very optimistic and things like that. But sometimes it's just seen as a strategic investment, right? Sometimes you have to invest and suffer a little bit to get foothold in that segment. And it was quite interesting. But like I said, the small thing like ashtrays, I think it's also very important. But the big hitters were always right-hand drive. I still remember at that time, 20 years ago, it was 50 million, $60 million extra that went into the program. So you can imagine how happy they were because every program was always at this minimum threshold. So that was interesting. And then Euro NCAP, so the crash test performance. At that time, it was very different versus the US. They did different type of test angles, rear impact, pedestrian impact, etc. And it became very pushy in the European press. So if you would come with a 1-star or 2-star crash test, it was disastrous. The customers didn't like it. For example, I'll give you an example. That was my moment of fame. I was on the French-speaking Swiss television. Interviewed in a consumer magazine when I was still working in Brussels. I had to fly to Geneva, or to Zurich. I think it was in Geneva. Anyway, in Geneva, in the French-speaking part. Why? Because the Chrysler Voyager had only a 2-star or something like that. A very bad crash test result. And I had to save the day there. And it was like very last minute. I remember, I think Steve Bartoli coming on and going, oh my God, we have this thing going on. And there's the bad crash test, and then the Swiss are going to put a TV program out. They're going to completely destroy it. It was a big market for us, Switzerland, or a very profitable market, not big, but very profitable. The Swiss, when they buy, and they take all the options and all the bells and whistles, and you really make a lot of money in Switzerland on your vehicles. And so I had to fly out there, and then you're sweating bullets. So I was armed with IIHS statistics and saying that in the real world, so you try to spin it a little bit, that in the real world is different from the test, and the test is different, and America is also very safety conscious and things like that. But you don't want to do that with every single car, so they had to put structures in and which are different, which didn't bring them anything for the US market. So I understood that they professionally hated me, but I tried to make up for that with my personality. They still like it. But listen, you have to be reasonable also, because that was another thing. A cultural thing. From the Mercedes side, the Germans were like, we want everything 100%. And sometimes you have to compromise, right? So I sometimes caught fire from that side saying I wasn't pushing hard enough with the engineers and things like that. But sometimes if you go for perfection, you get nothing and you die principled in beauty. And sometimes you go for very good but you can get things done quickly, and you have a car to launch, and you kind of skate around it a little bit. So sometimes I was like this little cultural difference, I should say. And I think in other podcasts they talked about it, and I noticed that so much. And so, but yeah, it was a very interesting time. So there was also the time when then Dr. Zetsche came. Wolfgang Bernhard was driving in his leather jacket, basically on a
Yeah.
on a Dodge Viper engine with two wheels on the stage, like Arnold Schwarzenegger with smoke around him. I mean, these guys were, and Dr. Z, and they were rock stars, right? This was great. This was I loved it. I actually loved my time there. But yeah, not easy. But you try to find a compromise, and we did quite some good things. So I remember the Voyager, for example, when it had stow and go. You remember Mike Donoghue? He made stow and go in the Voyager, which
Yes.
was phenomenal. You with the flip of a switch, boom, 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 your seats disappear, and you have basically a delivery van. Unbelievable. Nobody had this. And of course, because our car was made in Graz, in Austria, it was not foreseen for Europe, right? So then that was like a big one. And yeah, I knew Mike a little bit, that helped, but we made the the case, and we did it, and we got Stow and Go in Europe. And another one was diesel automatic. We had a diesel, but not with an automatic gearbox. And if you buy an American car, you don't want a manual one, and the Voyager was probably 80-90% diesel. So we had to go to automatic. That was a big engineering effort for the platform team, for the minivan platform team. First Gordon Rinchler, then Mike Donoghue, and didn't bring anything for the Americans, but they did it for them. For us, we could convince them. We had a good, solid business case, etc. So Stow and Go, diesel automatic, that kind of stuff was really good. So yeah, and then the merger came, and so many things have been said already. Helmut Grösser has talked about the cultural differences with the 25 Mercedes execs flying in with a combined total of 200,000 pages of binders, and then the Americans sitting there with a notebook. Very classic, and so it was interesting to watch that. But from an international point of view, I have to say we had quite some advantages, because certainly, for example, for our bigger cars, we got really good diesel engines. So in the Grand Cherokee, we got I think I even know the code, OM 64 or something like that. Anyway, the 3-liter V6 TDI common rail diesel from Mercedes, which is one of the best diesel engines in the world. We put that in the Grand Cherokee, also in the Commander. You remember the Commander?
Yes.
There, and also in the Chrysler 300C. That was fantastic. And then we did the Chrysler 3, or now it all comes back, the Chrysler 300C Touring, which was the Dodge Magnum. Which was kind of a sporty station wagon. When I saw that the first time in design, there you see how sometimes things happen. This was not planned for Europe. For Europe was a 300C sedan, but Europe was a station wagon market. You saw a lot of Mercedes E-Class station wagon, A6 station wagon, BMW 5 station wagon called Touring, etc., etc. And then in the 300C, we just had a sedan because there's a Chrysler 300C. And I walk in the design studio. I think Ralph Gilles was showing me around. And suddenly I see in the corner this big thing, and I'm like, "What the hell is this, Ralph?" "Oh yeah, but it's not for Europe. It's a Dodge." And I said, "But this is fantastic. This is like the 300C." Station wagon, right? Or this is why, but it's a Dodge Magnum. We can't do that. I say, guys, we have to have this. Oh no, we can't. And then all these brand theory people who go, "Oh, you're gonna kill the brand when you do this." They came up, and yeah, anyway. To cut a long story short, we fought that successfully. We made a business case, and we had a Chrysler 300C with the Dodge Magnum shape, which
Wagon
was
body.
basically a sporty wagon, and that was fantastic. So we sold over 20,000 a year, but I think we made over $25,000 per pop. So this was a super, super profitable car. So I'm very proud of that one, actually, and quite interesting how you see the product pragmatics versus the brand purists, and then you have to find this middle ground. So yeah, very interesting times.
No, it's there's definitely a red thread there where you can see that it's a company that's focused heavily on its largest market or the largest markets in NAFTA, and everything else was a battle, a little bit of a battle to try to
Absolutely.
extract something that would be suitable for sale in other countries around the globe. But it's I have to say that that is something fun to be in a position where you have to make those arguments and try to get that product
Yeah.
developed for your individual markets.
But it wasn't always easy, because I remember instances where there was a lot of tension because we wanted something. I couldn't get my way. Then my boss, or my boss's boss, Thomas Hausch, got involved and he called Eric Reidenauer and there was like back and forth and we're doing it. No, we're not doing it and things like that. So it was very, very interesting to see that. But at the end, everybody, I always say, nobody comes in the office in the morning and says, okay, I'm going to make a total mess out of this and I'm going to do things that are really bad. Nobody does that, right? Everybody goes in, I think, that's my base premise, goes in with, I'm going to do the best I can and this is what I think is going to help my company in the short term, mid-term, long term, etc. And if that is different from what I think, I try to understand what is the background of that, right? Why is that? And then you can discuss. And I think if you're reasonable in these kind of positions of tension,
Yes.
and you're a reasonable person to work with and things like that, it goes a long way. But you don't always win everything. So there's certain things which say,
Correct.
yeah, okay,
Correct.
it doesn't
You have
make
to
any
know
sense.
exactly which battle to fight.
You have to know which battle to go for, and I can also understand that the American engineering side where they go, of course we focus on our biggest market, and they're always short on people and budget, and there come these guys, on the fringe, and they want all this complicated, sophisticated stuff, because we were small in volume, but I was international, but it mainly meant Europe. So that was sometimes the criticism that I got, that it was a bit Eurocentric. We also had to do Japan, and China was still like very on the fringe right then, was not on the radar screen, which was a mistake in hindsight, because we were one of the first ones there with Beijing Jeep, and we didn't do anything with it. But anyway, it was very good, but European customers were the most demanding. So it has to go fast. Everything has to work. It cannot consume anything. It has to be crash safe for all kind of angles. So a complicated market. But if you, at that time at least, but I think it's still like that. It is still like that. If you can make it in Europe, then it's a very good platform to make it in the rest of the world. Things are changing now a little bit with China. Cars, the expectation of customers are shifting from the mechanical world into the electronic and the digital world. I should say, right? In the past, it was like it cannot rattle at 200 kmh and things like that. A millennial doesn't give a flip about that. He wants to order Uber Eats while he drives on a very interactive touchscreen. So that's now very, very different. It's changing a little bit, but at that time, it was that, and Europe was the most demanding market for that, I would say, the mechanical aspects of a vehicle. Now it becomes the digital aspects of a vehicle. And hello, wake up call to all the auto execs who are listening to this fantastic podcast of John Stech. It is now China. The Chinese customer, I can tell you, is the most demanding when it comes to the whole electronic and digital interconnectivity part of the automotive experience.
That concludes episode 1 with Benny Oeyen. Episode 2 next week will feature Benny talking about Kia Motors Europe, as well as his experiences in Shanghai with General Motors. Thank you for joining us on today's journey. Please remember to like and subscribe to the Auto Ethnographer and leave us a rating or comment. For more information, visit our website at auto-ethnographer.com. You can also follow on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.